Welcome to the second edition of the CASI Data Seminar Series. My name is Rukmini S. I am a data journalist and I was a 2022 Fall Visiting Fellow at CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India, CASI, at the University of Pennsylvania, is a unique research institution that aims to nurture a new generation of young scholars of contemporary India. My thanks to Tariq Tachil, CASI's wonderful director, who is also here this morning. The community of those working with data in India is wide, diverse, and vibrant. Over the last few years, advances in open data have allowed for a big leap in accessing and using this data, and this seminar series hopes to push that frontier further. Every month, a presenter with deep knowledge of a sphere of Indian data will present to us, leaving us with, we hope, a starter kit to use those data sets in our own work. Migration has an impact not just on the individual migrant, but also on both source and destination economies, patterns of marriage and family, changes in the workforce and politics, as also on cultures, movies, language, food. There isn't a part of India that is untouched by migration. As a result, a number of us in this community would like to better use data on migration in our work. However, in recent times, many of us have felt hamstrung by a lack of data. It gives me great pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Professor Chinmay Tumbe. Professor Tumbe Chinmay is Associate Professor in the Economics area at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He has written two fantastic books that I urge you to pick up: India Moving, A History of Migration, and The Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, How They Shaped India and the World. Chinmay is not just a leading intellectual in the field, he's also a great communicator and very generous with his time, and I look forward to learning a lot today. As always, please type your questions in the chat box and I'll either club them and ask Chinmay or will call upon you to unmute yourself at the end of Chinmay's presentation. Chinmay, over to you.
Hi, can you see this? Yeah. Great, thanks so much for having me over. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a very innovative webinar series, and I look forward to actually learning from the other ones. So it's an absolute honor to be presenting out here. I'm going to be talking about migration. It's a topic which is in a huge news, especially since the pandemic, when we saw those horrific scenes of people walking back home, literally. And that's the first time a lot of people realized just how short-staffed we are with migration data. By the end of this, I'll give you a sense of how migration researchers work with data, different databases. It's not the case that we do have excellent data on migration. So I'm not going to, unfortunately, I can't end with the idea that, we have excellent data on migration and you can work with migration anytime you want, but hopefully give you a flavor of what exists out there and what are the frontiers in this topic called migration data. Okay, very quick introduction about how many migrants we think there are in India. As per the census, for example, almost every adult woman is a migrant because you move upon marriage, right? So as per the Indian census, about 300 million women are migrants. We say there are over 100 million circular migrant workers. These are estimates ground up based on sectors. You can tease out the data in different ways, but that's a kind of go-to number which has emerged now over the last 10 years. About 30% of the Indian population is migrant, but 20 to 30% of the workforce is migrant. These are, again, large variation, 20 to 30% is huge in the population of India. There are also migrants outside India, which is important. You can't really talk about migration without talking of internal and international migration. So about 15 to 20 million immigrants and a diaspora, which means even second generation and so on, include about a diaspora of about 30 million people around the world. And there are a few million immigrants. You might see this number, 20 million Bangladeshi immigrants. There's really no truth to that number, in the sense it's a number floating around for the last 25 years. It's just one of those numbers which keeps floating around. But if based on various ways, we think there are about a few million immigrants, mostly from Bangladesh and Nepal. So when you talk about migration, just a quick ready reckoner on some of the core concepts, right? So when we look at a migration statistic or an indicator, what are we really talking about? So one is, of course, volumes. We want to know how many people from Gujarat went back to Uttar Pradesh during the pandemic. That's the volume number. But more often, we're interested in rates. What is the migration rate? So the migration rate of Mumbai, for example, might be more than 50%, which means more than half the people in Mumbai are migrants. And in Calcutta, it might be 10 or 20%. which means only 10 or 1, 10 or 2 out of 10 are migrants. So rates are very important. We talk typically in terms of rates, in terms of in-migration rates and out-migration rates. People are coming to places, people are going out from. So typically out-migration rates of more than 5% at, say, a district level is actually a very large number, right? Because typically people who migrate are of certain age groups, not everyone migrates. So a number above 5% at the out-migration rate is quite high. And any number about 20, 30% in terms of in-migration rates is very large. For example, at the global level, immigration rates in the US, Western Europe is between 10 and 20%. That is the stock of foreign people in those countries, about 10 to 20%. In Canada, Australia, it might be slightly more. And in the Gulf countries, of course, it's spectacularly high. UAE, for instance, some of the countries in the Gulf have immigration rates of more than 80%, or 8 out of 10 are immigrants. Stocks and flows, source and destination. You can capture or present data at the individual level or at the household level. Something like, in fact, this is one of my favorite indicators, the percentage of households in a region which, for example, send out migrants, or the percentage of households in a region which receive remittances. I think that's a very good indicator. And of course, internal and international. So in this talk, I'm going to go over the census. Unfortunately, we don't have the 2021 census, but remember that the census of India has been happening since the 1880s, and as someone who 1870s, and as someone who loves history, I've kind of poured through these census documents, like 15 censuses, also that we've had across more than 100 years. The national sample surveys, also powerful. Unfortunately, the last one is 2007-8, but that was in a way the most comprehensive migration database that we've ever had in India. A lot of other surveys, I'll give us a glimpse of those. And of course, newer databases, transport, unfortunately not fully publicly accessible, but I'll show you the power of that. Google Mobility, which unfortunately has been shut down on October 15, 2022, but for 2.5 years gave you phenomenal insights into mobility in India. And mobile phone based, which is a very promising way to track mobility, right? So this is the broad overview of what I'm going to be covering. Okay, let's start with the census, right? So what does the census really ask? And it's a good point to just pause and say, who is a migrant? What is the definition of a migrant? Typically, we use two definitions in the census: the place of birth, which means if I'm in Ahmedabad and I was born in Mumbai, when the census official comes to me in Ahmedabad and asks me, what was your place of birth? I say Mumbai, automatically I'm a migrant, right? The problem with this definition, of course, is that if I was born in Mumbai and I lived in Ahmedabad for 10 years and I went back to Mumbai, then the census official who comes to my house in Mumbai and asks me, are you a migrant? And asks me, where are you enumerated right now in Mumbai? And where are you where is the place of birth? I will say Mumbai. So in that case, on the place of the birth statistics, I would not be counted as a migrant. Right? And that is why we have a concept called place of last residence. So place of last residence is a more powerful way because you capture multiple moves. And it's this distinction makes a huge difference in India because we have so much of circular migration. Just to give you an example, in the census, there are actually very few in-migrants in the state of Kerala. Now, virtually, anyone who knows Kerala knows there's massive connection of Kerala with the Gulf countries. And a lot of people, a huge part of the labor force goes to the Gulf and comes back. So on the place of birth, there are very few. If you ask a Keralite, are you a migrant? They say, no, I'm from here. Right? And so you're not captured as a migrant, when technically you're a return migrant. Right? So these definitions of migration matter hugely. The census also asks you a question of reason for migration and then duration of stay. Sometimes they also go out of the way and give you data which is spectacular. For example, in 2001, they gave a special table D13, which enabled a district to district migration mapping. It's the only time the census has done something like that. Unfortunately, otherwise, from the census, what you can know is any district of India, you can know which part of India you've come from, but only at the state level. So you can know how many migrants there are, for example, in Tirupur from Bihar, but not necessarily from Saran district in Bihar. Now, technically, the data exists. The census does not disseminate it. They did disseminate it once in 2001, which enabled a district-to-district migration corridor mapping. It's a very powerful exercise, as you can imagine. But a lot of people focus only on migration. There are other aspects of the census which also give you a lot of data on migration. For example, sex ratios. Because migration in India for work can be so male-dominated, it leaves its imprint in sex ratios. And remember, sex ratios are there in every survey. For example, the PLFS, any periodic survey gives you sex ratio data. The minute you do a large survey, you basically what you get basic, if you have a question on age and gender in any survey, you can calculate sex ratios. And that is why this is a very powerful way to estimate, basic aspects of migration. And I've used this a lot in my research. Another lesser known aspect is language. The fact that you speak a language and you're enumerated in different districts of India means it leaves a particular imprint of that particular community. So to give you a glimpse of how migration data looks like, this is probably the first time census data was neatly mapped out by a migration researcher. This is Kingsley Davis's lovely book, The Population of India and Pakistan. For all you researchers out there, definitely a highly recommended book. It has amazing data visualization, a book written in 1951, which would put many of us to shame, fantastic infographics and so on. And what this shows you is male migration. The size of the arrow shows you how big. So a lot of the migration was eastbound from Bihar and Orissa to Bengal and from Bengal to Assam. That's the big thing. But you can see the flows between provinces of those times. Of course, the map looked very different, but this was probably the first time census data was used to, in one kind of diagram, show you the key migration corridors. Right? It's a very powerful visual, which Davis had done. And of course, a lot of researchers since then have kind of done similar work with various censuses. But with the historic data, you can also do much more because the data is available at the district level. This is my work for 1901. This is 120 years back. The x-axis shows you in-migration rate. So Bombay, for example, had a migration rate of close to 80% back then. And the y-axis is actually something on sex ratios. Right? And you'll see districts like Saran, Ratnagiri, the percentage difference. So this is the metric here, the percentage difference between the 20 to 40 age group sex ratio and the 0 to 20. Because migration leaves a footprint in the 20 to 40 age group. And if more men are out, you get the phenomenon missing women. So you get much more women in the source region districts in the core age groups. And for example, Bombay, you get this minus 50 kind of a number, which is basically showing you male surplus. So a lot of districts in India have male surpluses and a lot of districts have male deficits, and that's captured by sex ratios, right? And sex ratio data is available from any survey, every large sample kind of survey. So coming to 2011, this is what the questionnaire will do. It asks you place of birth, place of last residence, and then it will ask you rural and urban. So you can, with this 24B, you can map out rural to urban, rural to rural, urban to rural, and urban to urban migration. Right? So 4 principal streams. And the reason for migration: work, business, education, marriage, moved after birth, moved with household. There's one issue here. Most women will say they're moving for marriage, even if they're moving for work. Right? So women's migration for work, for instance, is undercounted in India because all the women's migration is typically, most of it is clubbed under marriage. Right? And that is why typically people who want to see women migrant workers look at data on women migrants and if they're working. Right? And that becomes women migrant workers. But if you use just the reason, you find virtually very few women are actually migrating. And then you have the duration of stay. Did the migrant move in the last 5 years, in the last 10 years, in the last 30 years? This is useful to calculate flows. Right? Flows and stocks comes from this data. So this is all that the census has on migration, but very useful to generate a lot of charts. This is what the census will give you in terms of the tables. For example, there are typically 12 tables, population by place of birth and sex. So this is what, if you go to the census website, you will download files, and in each folder, you'll have files for state level, right? State level data. So what can you do with census data? You can draw charts like this. These are maps of the, this is from 2001 census. What is the female migration rate of India, right? And it varies substantially from less than 30% to over 50%. Why? Because essentially it differs by marriage patterns. In Tamil Nadu, for instance, a lot of marriages happen within the family. Women do not move outside the village, for instance. So you automatically get lower women migration rates in Tamil Nadu. As you go northwest, you get much more. The other map is on interstate migration, and you'll see it's mostly along the borders, again, reflecting marriage migration. But you'll see in Punjab and Haryana, because they have this missing women phenomenon in the lowest age groups, a lot of women migration happens to these states to kind of fill in the marriage market, so to speak. Right? So different patterns, but this is what you can do with census data. You can map out migration at the district level. And you can do this across census. Okay, this is migration rates by age. All of this is stuff doable by census. You'll see women's migration rate goes up tremendously after marriage. So after 15 age group, virtually all women are migrants. We're saying 80%. But for men, of course, it differs by urban and rural. And the bottom line is rural male. The next line is urban male, and then you have urban female and rural. Right. So this is how it varies by age group overall. Migration rates in India have picked up as per the census dramatically between 2001 and 11. You'll see it's about, overall, it's close to 35 to 40%. 1 in 3 are migrants. And if you see, by gender and so on, there's been a huge surge in female migration in the recent census. This is something more on migration and cohorts. You can make the matrice, the rural to urban matrice, right? And you'll see in 2011, for the first time, arguably, the number of migrants from the census, rural to urban, is the same as urban to urban. Urban to urban migration is now a huge stream in India, that is city to city migration. And that's about 80 million people moving from urban to urban and rural to urban, right? So these are the kind of stuff you can generate out of census data. Now, a lot of this has limitations. And the key limitation is that a lot of circular migrant workers are not captured by the census, precisely because oftentimes they live in very precarious sites which are not covered by the census at all, even though in theory the census is supposed to capture everyone. Oftentimes when the census goes, the people are migrated out and they are not captured in the destination region. So for a variety of reasons, we say these numbers are underestimates. This is work done for the economic survey, again showing you, number of people. So about the census captures about 51 million people who moved for economic reasons, right? But we think that's a huge underestimate, and by different ways you can bump up that number actually closer to 100 million. Okay, now here are some really interesting charts, again generated from the census. It's a heat map of Mumbai and Delhi. Where do the migrants come from, right? And you can see Mumbai is the city which draws in migrants from all across India. So what is this data? It's the place of last residence, and it's particular data of people who migrated in the last 10 years. And this is data for census 2001. As I said, it's the only census which gave us data which enabled district to district map. So these are just two charts for two districts, that is, Mumbai and Delhi, so to speak. But it's very powerful because it shows you that in the 1990s, where were people moving from to those particular cities, right? And you can generate these charts for the 1990s for all of India. You can, in theory, do that for 2011, but the census needs to give you data, right? So you can maybe apply. I've not been able to get that data, but in theory, the data exists. You can draw such detailed, fine-grained migration maps in India based on the census itself. Okay, this is Calcutta, Surat. You can see Surat, for example, this one district on the coast of Orissa sends out more than 100,000 migrants, Ganjam as it's called. So you find these migration corridors just purely out of simple maps like these. This is intercity migration, again in the 1990s. You can see how this migration flight from Calcutta, for instance, which many people document, you can see these things in charts and tables like these. Some more metrics from the census in the economics survey of 2016-17 used not the migration data, but a cohort-based data. The basic idea out here is simple. If most migrants start migrating after the age of 15 or 20, then if migration rates pick up, typically in any region, you can see from one census to another census, the population change by cohorts, right? And if there's a massive migration impact, it should bump up the numbers of population in certain cohorts. So this is not using migration data at all. It is using age sex data. And that's the y-axis. It's called the cohort-based migration metric. It's basically about the increase in population by cohorts adjusted for mortality, right? And you'll see how nicely it correlates with per capita income. The richest states of India have in-migration, the poorest states of India have out-migration, right? And the key out here is that you're using not migration data, but basic population data cohort. Okay, more powerful uses of the census. This is 110 years of data showing you the persistence of mass male migration from two districts, Ratnagiri and Udupi, which have had a missing women phenomenon now for really long periods of time, right? So the sex ratios of these districts have never really been under 1,100 females to males. So again, this is sex ratio data, but it reveals a lot about migration, right? In one kind of snapshot. This is for more recent periods, sex ratio by age group. You can see India's sex ratio chart by age group looks like this. For Kerala, it gets bumped up. Why? Because a lot of men from Kerala go to the Gulf, much more. And within Kerala, the district most affected by migration is Malappuram. And you'll see even within Kerala, Malappuram district sex ratio gets bumped up even more, right? This is the phenomenon of missing women in the source, missing men in the source region because the men are. So again, you can get a lot of stuff from sex ratios, and sex ratios are widely available. And that's why I say it's not just the migration question, but in many parts of India, the sex ratios itself are very powerful. Just to tell you how powerful they are, this is a correlation chart of the sex ratio variables with actual migration variables. And you see at the core age group of about 25 to 29, 30 to 34, the x-axis, the correlation coefficient is as high as 0.7, which means just age group sex ratios are telling you a story of migration. Even without a question on migration, you infer data on migration just through sex ratio. And that's the feature of Indian migration, which is very sex selective in many, many parts. Okay, different uses of the census. I talked about migration and sex ratios. Language, right? So you want to see the migration of Marwadis in India, right? And to the extent that people are reporting Marwadi as a language, you can see the migration of Maharashtrians, the migration of a lot of linguistic groups in India. This is the data of Marwadi speakers in 1961. Of course, most of them are based in Rajasthan, but you see this cluster in northern Maharashtra, where you find a lot of Marwadis. And you can compare this between the Marwadis and Gujaratis. I did this for a project on the migration of business communities of India. And you see how the Gujaratis are much more settled in Tamil Nadu, for instance, right? And you see the districts in South India, which are marked green, which shows you the presence of Gujarati speakers out there. So this is not migration data. This is language data telling you information on migration. And often this is useful because this also captures to a certain element the second generation, right? So now, even if you're not a migrant in the sense you're born in Coimbatore, but you're essentially a Gujarati family, it captures an element of the diaspora, right? So the census is very powerful for direct questions on migration, but also not very direct questions. Okay, moving on to surveys, major surveys on migration in India. The National Sample Survey has asked a question on migration in all these surveys. Unfortunately, for the last 15 years, the NSS has not asked a question on migration. I'm told that the more recent one has a question, but I remember when the 2007-8 survey came out, I was probably the first one to purchase that CD and analyze that data set. And we thought that we'll get this database every 5 years. It's not happened since 2007-8. So we're really stuck because the 2007-8 was probably the best migration database that we've ever had in India. We've also had other surveys, for example, the Kerala Migration Survey. If you're working on Kerala, you should know that there's excellent data on Kerala conducted by CDS in Trivandrum for many, many years, right? They've done it, I think, more than 10, maybe almost 10 times now. Goa had a migration survey, Punjab had a migration survey, Gujarat had a migration survey, Tamil Nadu had a migration survey, and these were large sample surveys. In fact, the sample size was much larger than the national sample surveys for this, and the governments supported those migration surveys. Work in progress. As we speak, there's a Jharkhand migration survey going on, right? So different states of India have their own migration surveys at work. And then there are other surveys with migration information. In the Human Development Survey, the CMI, NCR, National Family Survey. I'm going to talk a little bit about IHDS and CMI later on. The others, I'm just pointing out that people have used them. Many of them are very old. The ICRSAT village level studies, for example, captures panel data and so on. The National Family Survey, some people have tried using. Unfortunately, there's a very limited information on migration. And when I've kind of worked with that data, I have not found it a satisfactory variable, which means it doesn't quite square up with the evidence provided in the census and the NSS. So I'm a bit skeptical of the value of NFHS in giving you anything on migration. But the IHDS, fairly good. CMI yet to be explored. It's a very, very recent one. But precisely because CMI has something on migration, it can potentially be used, but it has to be always, of course, squared with what the census and NSS is saying. A chart on the right just showing you different studies using these surveys. This chart comes from a document I've compiled, which is freely available online. It's called the India Migration Bibliography, compendium of about 3,000 studies on migration in India. So to move to the NSS, because this was the best migration database that we had till date, 2007-8, it captured the value of the NSS, which is even greater than census, is that it asked you not just in migration. When the census comes to your house, it just asks you, are you a migrant? Right? It does not ask, were there people in your house who moved out, which is what we call as out migration data. And the NSS did that. They asked you not only if you're a migrant to capture in migration, they also asked you, are there people in your house who moved out? Right? So it also gave you out migration data. It also asked you a question, are there people who moved out for short term, for a few months, captured seasonal migration? So that's why we say, this is probably the best questionnaire till date. It also covered remittances, how much money is sent back and so on. And of course, a lot of papers have been written on this. I, for example, quantified the remittance economy of India, using this data. Others have looked at job recruitment networks and so on. Okay, the NSS, I'm going to probably skip this. Many of you know, it's a large sample survey. There are different, stratification strategies. The NSS manual typically lists all of this. The 2007-8 one was a 125,000 household survey, right? So this is a large sample survey. Most others are not so large. about 5,000 households per state, and about 200 households per district. So if you're doing a survey, this is like a good benchmark to keep. 200 households per district is pretty much what the NSS was doing in 2007-8. And how good is the NSS data? Remarkably, you could actually compare this with some other surveys which were done at roughly the same time. So in this chart, I'm looking at a particular statistic, the percentage of households receiving remittances, and I'm comparing two completely different databases, the National Sample Survey, which is on the x-axis, and the Kerala Migration Survey, which the CDS did in Kerala, in the same time period, but with 3 times larger sample, right? So the KMS was a larger study than the NSS, and you find that the correlation is like 0.9. But the Kerala Migration Survey did give you higher migration rates, in the sense higher remittance intensity in this time than the NSS. So we say that the NSS are also underestimates, right? And that's because the Kerala Migration Survey asked a direct question: were you ever in the Gulf? Like, so when you elicit responses directly, because if you ask a person in Kerala, are you from Kerala? The person will say yes, right? But if you ask a direct question saying, did you at some point work in the Gulf? You're much more likely to say yes, rather than call yourself a return migrant from the Gulf. So how you ask the question matters hugely in migration. And in general, we say census underestimates than the NSS, and the NSS also is an underestimate to actual migration surveys, which are very clever in eliciting migration responses, right? But for the purpose of variation across states, the NSS does a great job, because you can see this is like almost perfect correlation between the NSS and the KMS. So what does the NSS ask? It asks you all these questions. The out migrant, so this is the out migrant schedule. It asks you, where are you moving? It asks you, when did you go? What are you doing? Did you send back money? If so, how much money you sent back, right? So this is the out migration schedule of the NSS. This is the in migration schedule. It asks you, are you a migrant? Which was your last place of residence, and so on. In the NSS, typically 6 months is used as the reference period. So if you move from a place to another place and have lived there for more than 6 months, you're considered to have changed your usual place of residence. And that's why basically you're considered to be a migrant. And so that's the general ready reckoner of who is a migrant in the NSS. And they also ask you reason for migration and so on. You can't, however, map out district to district level migration using the NSS. You can only map out state to district. So like the census, it captures data. The last place of residence is at the state level. It does not ask for a district level identifier. Okay, limitations of the NSS or any survey for that matter: respondent fatigue, inaccurate data entry. But one thing that really matters in the case of the migration is the last bullet point. That is, when the NSS goes and it finds, oftentimes, if you go to Uttarakhand, you'll find a lot of houses just locked up, right? In regions with mass out migration, the household is simply not there, right? So what do you do then when you ask? You basically are, in fact, you might go to Uttarakhand in a village and come to the wrong conclusion that there's no out migration, precisely because everyone who has out migrated have locked houses. So those who are there, who you get in the sample, are precisely the people who have not out migrated. And so you can come to crazy conclusions in migration research that, nobody is migrating from this place when actually there's mass migration. So these are important kind of limitations. One is of the census in terms of not capturing out migration, but even when you capture out migration, if the entire household has moved itself, then that becomes a limitation, right? And so, for example, the NSS estimates only 4.5 Indian people outside India, when the actual number using embassy data around the world is about 10 million, right? So it's like half of what the out migrate. And that is because a lot of people move en masse and are simply not captured in the NSS data. Okay, what can you do with NSS data? This is a table which shows you, for example, different types of migration: seasonal migration, remittance-based migration. And you'll see, if you look at the MPC stuff, which is basically the poorest to richest, seasonal migration is overrepresented among the poor. Other forms of migration, it's underrepresentation. So there are two distinct kinds of migration streams in India. The shorter the duration, the poor are overrepresented. The longer the duration, the rich are overrepresented. Right? That's the kind of most stylized fact in Indian migration study. This is the chart you can make with NSS, right? It's a very rich chart which quickly tells you at the district level the key hotspots of out migration in India. Right? And the red shaded districts are ones where over 25% of households has a migrant who has gone in search of work. Major cluster in Bihar, Eastern UP, Rajasthan, coastal Orissa, coastal west coast of India, and the Himalayan region. And the circles then denote seasonal migration. So those are districts where not so much of out migration happens for long duration work, but for extremely short duration work, around Mehboob Nagar, around this junction of Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and Gujarat, and also in Chhattisgarh and Western Rajasthan. So different forms of migration, but the base of this map that you see is National Sample Survey. Right? So we are hopeful that the NSS kickstarts this, but if you're working on migration in the long run, you should know that this is a very rich data set to talk about migration. This is something more. On the left is urbanization statistics coming from the census. On the right is out-migration statistics coming from the NSS. And you see this massive region, which is not urban in India, like Bihar, Eastern UP, on the left, which is actually sending out a lot of migrants across India. Right? So you can juxtapose census and NSS data to tell stories of migration. You can also tell stories of migration, of international migration. Right? So the chart that you see here is about where Indians are around the world, but I want you to focus on the inset chart, which is on the right, which is again a district level mapping of India and where the money is going to. So where is money from outside going to? And this is again the percentage of households receiving international remittances. You can do that with NSS data, and you can see how Kerala gets a lot of money, how Canada to Punjab is a huge corridor. So districts in Punjab get a lot of money, districts in Telangana, northern Rajasthan. Unfortunately, this is now 15-year-old data. But you can supplement this, of course, with a lot of new data that's emerging, international migration. Okay, India Human Development Survey is another database. This is again a huge household survey, 2004, 5, and then again 11, 12. This is an example of a research paper based on this. Again, it asks you a question on out migration, right? So that's useful because you can ask questions like, for example, in this case, what is the impact of male out migration on women left behind? This is Sonali Desai Banerjee paper, which looks at how does women's autonomy change with male out migration. So again, the core question here is on out migration. They also have a question on remittance. Right? So this has been used by some researchers in migration work. The CMI is, of course, now one of the widely used databases. It's periodic, 3 times a year, and so on. In theory, of course, they have these questions on migration. They have quite a few questions on migration. For example, where you're going. They also have, will you immigrate in the future? Reason why a member wants to emigrate meaning out migrate, and so on. The state from where people have come. So it has both in migration and out migration questions in its data. Right? So the CMI is, the migration data is there. Is it accurate? Is it reflecting the migration scenario that the census and NSS is saying? We still don't know enough because not many people have actually used the CMI to understand migration. But the migration data is there. And of course, going forward, I'm sure there'll be external validation studies to kind of show how good this data is. But this is, again, very new stuff. It's just come out in the last couple of years. So researchers also look at their own private surveys. This is a chart on the right with all the dots showing you various re-studies that have happened. Village re-study is a whole genre in itself in research, and these are sites of village re-studies in India. And I say this because a lot of the village re-study data captures very rich migration data. And so if you're working in any of these parts of India, do look up these re-studies because you'll find that inevitably, we did a study on the Konkan region, that's our study, and we very rich data, 5 decades of data of how people have moved in those places. So this is micro level data. This is not at the macro level. This is micro level data, but very important data on migration nevertheless. Recent studies, again, based on private researchers who have kind of done excellent work on migration using their own surveys, right? So for example, the Kerala migration surveys, which are a model for Kerala by Irudaya Rajan at CDS. Chetan Chotani has something, Eastern India, and Adam and Tariq have something called Migrants and Machine Politics. The book is, I think, yet to be released. So it's still, I think it's coming out this year. And but I've been following both their work over the last decade. And a lot of this is very rich survey-based work in slums and variety of settings in urban India. So again, these are ways it's important to know the questions these researchers are asking because often they yield very interesting insights. This is, for example, from Chetan's book. It's just 2 sites, but it's mapping out all the moves from those sites, right? So where are people from those 2 sites going out? And it's a very interesting map because a lot of them are going within India, but then a lot of them are going outside India. All right, moving from census and NSS, last 10 minutes I'm going to take out here. Transport. It would be amazing, of course, if we had the data released by the Indian Railways. It happened only once, to the best of my knowledge, in 2016-17 for the economic survey. And you can see how interesting it was, right? You can see the Bihar to Delhi corridor on the left, which is a huge migration corridor. Interesting networks, which we did not quite know, basically from Gujarat to Tamil Nadu. That's not really a migration network, it's just a high density travel network. But in general, the kind of net passenger flow data, which was used for this particular chapter, was a very powerful way to understand, again, migration, and it estimated migration to be much more than what the census and NSS was saying, right? So again, can you get this data? I would imagine that if you're a researcher for a particular region, it is possible to go to maybe offices and get data at a localized level. So maybe what is the railway passenger traffic data for a particular station, right? It's unfortunate that the ministry does not release this data for all of India, but you can potentially go to a particular station and start observing this, right? And this is, of course, a very powerful way. Other thing is buses, of course. You can, again, go to bus stands and try and understand what is happening out there. But buses and trains, the basic way people move in India, is a hugely untapped source. And the railways, the one time it was released, the data, it was clearly a very powerful source. The other data, which is not known at all, is actually flight traffic data. And because a lot of traffic now is urban to urban, there's a lot of movement now happening to cities by planes, right? And interestingly, the civil aviation has a lot of data published in its annual reports and so on. This, for example, is a simple metric of immigration. Is about how many people leave India by air minus how many people enter India by air. And you can see, like, from 2001, the numbers have been growing up. About 1 million people on net have been growing. This is actually a simple metric of immigration flows, right? This data stops in 2010, but you can extend it, and the numbers are 1.5 to 2 million today. But that's the kind of a simple metric of looking at passenger traffic data from air. This is what is reported on the Ministry of Civil Aviation website every single day. Every single day you have this data, right? So you have, for example, on the international traffic, how many people are leaving and how many people are arriving. So if you are clever enough, you just basically scrape this data on a daily basis, and you have a daily time series of aggregate numbers. But if you push, hopefully, the ministry, maybe they can also release more disaggregate numbers by airports and so on, right? So this is another thing which is not really being used too much. And I'm sure researchers are going to push both the railways and the aviation guys to start releasing this data more often going forward. Okay, One Nation, One Ration card has left a new data imprint. Unfortunately, just in the last 1 week or so, they have shut down the portal. It's not as extensive as it was earlier. They've not shut it down, but they've made the unit level data disappear. What they had online for more than a year was basically individual level data of each person accessing the One Nation, One Ration card. You could see at what time, what day, the name of the person also, unfortunately, in which state the person belonged to, and in which state the person was acquiring this particular PDS benefit. And on the basis of scraping millions of observations, this paper was published in the EPW, maybe I think December, which basically looks at, again, migration. And not surprisingly, states like Bihar, UP, for example, have much more out migration than many other states. But this was unique because it gave you administrative data set on migration, right? And maybe this data will come online again. The limitation, of course, is that as of now, the One Nation, One Ration card scheme has very limited offtake. There's just virtually only a few 100,000 transactions happening on a monthly basis. So if it gets more traction and if the data is released, this becomes, again, a very powerful source of migration statistics. Last few minutes on mobile phones. And mobile phones is probably the most promising way going forward to track human beings, for the simple reasons that we all carry mobile phones today. Mobile phone penetration is so high now in India that you could not probably do this 10 years back, but this is now the cutting edge. So I'm going to talk about 3 distinct methods with mobile phones. One is Google, right? So if you have this Google apps and so on, and if you had your location tags on, Google basically started releasing this data across the world. And in India, they did this for all districts, right? And what did they do? They presented a score, which the data is presented as the percentage change in visitors from pre-pandemic baseline, right? So what they measure is that, typically, if you're sleeping, the phone is with you, it kind of measures your inertia of where you are. And then during the day, you make moves, and it kind of tracks where you're going. It gave you data based on whether you're going to restaurants, cafes, shopping centers, libraries, movie theaters. But there was one category called recreation and retail, which I thought was a very good category to look at. And this was the data done. It, of course, did not present data if the sample was too small. But for most districts of India, this was pretty cool. And people are using this throughout the pandemic to kind of track mobility. this is what it looked like, right? So for example, each line on this chart is a state of India. And you see what happens during the first lockdown, because it was a national lockdown massively enforced. You can see all the states of India, shut down, March 24th shutdown, all the states, the mobility falls by almost 100%, 90%. So the metric on the left is a percentage change. The y-axis is the percentage change in mobility since the baseline. The baseline is Jan-Feb 2020. That's the pre-pandemic baseline. And then you see the fall, and then you see the unlock, but it never quite goes past zero. And then the second wave happens roughly April, May 2021, and again it goes down, but you see that it's not as coordinated as what was happening earlier. Now, this is not really interstate mobility. This is pretty much intra-district, intra-settlement mobility, right? But a good proxy also of intrastate mobility. When this pandemic was happening, I did talk to the Google folks. They did show me data on interstate mobility, and they said, interstate migration is very well proxied by the Google mobility tracker, that if for a district mobility is going down, even the interstate aspect of that mobility of that district is going down. And so it became a very good proxy for that. And you can see, of course, it passes zero, only late in 2021. And now the database is stopped. But when it was on, you could do amazing stuff. For example, you could plot this mobility at the district level across India, right? And you could see, for example, during the devastating second wave, in a way, this map actually shows you how the pandemic spread in India. At the second wave, we still don't know how the pandemic, spread, but you can see in April 1, the green shaded areas are where mobility had crashed substantially. Right? And you can see the second wave really emerges in some ways from Maharashtra, maybe in central Maharashtra. We still don't know exactly which districts and so on. But you can see by April 1, some districts were in complete lockdown. Even when the government had not enforced a lockdown, they were panicking and basically stopped moving around. Right? And then you see by April 27th, it spread over, especially Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. And by May 7th, it's pretty much all over India, the lockdown. And note that in this case, in the second wave, the lockdowns were not necessarily enforced by states. This reflected more of people stopping mobility because things had gone so bad during the second wave that everyone was scared and stopped moving, irrespective of what the government said. So this is how powerful the data can look like, right? And hopefully Google actually starts it on again, because it can give you a lot of information based on certain baselines. Facebook is another thing. Of course, not many of us use Facebook anymore, right? But Facebook, to the extent that Facebook can provide some data, this is a paper, again, which uses Facebook's data for good project. It's, again, confined to those who have smartphones. If you don't have smartphones, and if you don't have Facebook, it doesn't capture. But they captured, hundreds of thousands of moves. And this particular paper looks at, how during the pandemic, what were the movements looking like. So this is, again, using mobile phone data, but linked with Facebook. This is the most recent work, which is looking at a very interesting source, which can give you state level mobility on a monthly basis, right? And it was never really known until these guys published it a few months back. What they look at is essentially the fact that the Telecom Regulation Authority of India every month publishes a simple fact of how many people are active subscribers and how many people are not, right? Now, the thing is, if you're in Delhi and you got a connection in Delhi, and if your phone is not based in Delhi, basically you're a migrant, and you're on roaming, and this data is published. Right? So for example, in each telecom circle of India, how many people are within and how many people are outside at every month. Right? And this is happening now. I mean, this is data which goes back a long time, and this is data which will hopefully continue. So this is one of those live data sets on migration now. The only thing is it's at the state level, and you have to make a lot of assumptions. And unless there's something dramatic, these numbers are not going to change. But if you read the paper, read the methodology, this in a way becomes the most live data set that we have now on migration. And hopefully somebody pushes TRI to get it even more detailed. So for example, what do these numbers look like? What these guys found, for example, during May 2020, when the reverse migration happened in a big way, they found about 12 million people who have moved out from their circles that they were typically located in, right? So they estimate that during the first lockdown, 44 million people moved back. Right, much more than the number given by the government of India, which is about 11 million. This is interstate migration using mobile phone data. And during the second lockdown, about 26 million. Right? And you can see how people, if you look at the chart on the right, the Mumbai, Maharashtra, Gujarat, NCR, exactly what you'll predict. People basically are leaving those places, and people are found now registered in West. So this is just using the idea of roaming. Right? what we actually call roaming is being tapped by researchers to find out whether you're a migrant or not. All right, so I'll end here. Just to point out that there are very innovative places you never know when migration data turns up. I was once in this library at CDS in Trivandrum, and I stumbled across old annual reports of the Indian Post Office. And I used that to generate this chart. This chart has, it's a neat chart which shows you data from 100 years back. And it shows you high outmigration districts like Cuttack, Saran, Balasore, Puri, and so on. But the remarkable thing of the statistic is that it uses no direct migration. Right? So the y-axis is sex ratio, and the x-axis is the number of postal money orders, right, divided by the number of occupied houses. So no migration numbers, but still tells you a powerful story of which districts in those times had high outmigration, right? Using postal money order data and sex ratio. So if you're working on migration, there is of course the core migration data, the census and NSS, or the surveys which ask you question migration, but migration leaves its imprint in mysterious ways, right? Whether it's the mobile phone roaming, whether it's sex ratios, and as long as you're alert to those imprints, you can generate maybe even your own data set. So I'll stop here. These are some resources that I have, one on my Google site, one is a bibliography of about 3,000 odd studies, and a movie, if you want to see a good movie on migration, Gaman, a 1978 movie in India. This is a book that I've written on migration, which also conveys a lot about the history. And there's another book on the history of pandemics. So with that, I'll end and open to questions.
Thanks, Chinmay. That was fantastic. And it was also great to see both what can be said with traditional data sources, as well as what were, some of the new directions that innovative sources are taking us to. I am going to ask Ravi to unmute himself to ask his question about trains data, because I think things that we can do with transport data is going to be on everybody's mind. So
thank you. So can you hear me? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
So regarding trains, I thought you could just look at the schedules that the railways publish, and then presumably they must be responsive to demand, and you know how many trains are running, how often, and how it changes over time. So you actually have much more interesting data there, like did certain routes get removed or more added and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and there's no doubt that migrants themselves lobby for new train routes and so on.
Yeah.
The only thing is how high frequency that is, right? So if you're looking at new train routes over a period of 20 years, yes, definitely more kind of lines are laid out, or more routes are created, or more trains are run on certain tracks precisely because of demand, right? So in a way, the Indian Railways is succumbing to demand and starting new. So you're absolutely right. That leaves an imprint, and one can use that to understand the hot corridors of migration which are emerging in India, but again, not as high frequency, right? And so ideally, one still wants the station. I mean, the data set that was got in 2016-17 was passenger level data of every station of India, right? That is a huge data set, as one can imagine. And again, the database exists. It's just that it's not publicly.
And how about public transport buses? Like the state road transports are actually much more probably.
Yeah, I've not seen anybody use that, but as I said, you have to just go out there. You have to maybe Redbus, right, which is a huge portal. Get access to Redbus, like how this team got access to Facebook. Get access to Redbus.
No, because I think the state transports are not in the Redbus database. I think probably like Maharashtra State Road Transport and Tamil Nadu, they have different things.
Absolutely. So, and again, I'm just saying the transport data, the fact is that the data exists. It's about access. It's not that the data does not exist. They're generating the data. It's used for internal purposes, but it's really not. The problem is access. And I think you can get localized access, right? So you can get it from one station, one bus stand, and so on. And so it depends on what scale you want to understand migration. But it's completely, it should be, in theory, of course, be doable.
I'm going to ask Abhimanyu to unmute himself and ask his question about the intensity of migration.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tumbe. It was really an insightful presentation. I was just wondering, what was the intensity of migration you mentioned in the railway, that map between Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, please?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a mystery when the map came out. I don't think it conveys a real sense of migration. But it's just that it's a summation of many, routes along the way, right? So there's a lot of migration happening to Gujarat, for instance, from, Andhra Pradesh, for instance. or Orissa for sure. But the Gujarat to Chennai, that particular line, you should refer it more as a summation of short distance migration than rather that people are moving from Gujarat to them. And so it just so happens that the line looks in that way. But yes, it was a big mystery when it came about. I don't really have a satisfactory answer. All the other migration corridors out there map out neatly onto what we already know, right? But that was a bit of a mystery spot when people.
Could that be the result of business? Because people in
not so much. No, I think it's an artifact of short distance summations. Yeah, we don't have so much of migration from Tamil Nadu to Gujarat.
Thanks, Chinmay. And I think, when you presented a lot of this historical data, I think a number of researchers are, interested and also interested in understanding how to access this data. So Ritika, for example, asks if the pre-1991 census data, is there a place that it's digitized and available? How is that? How does access to that work?
Yeah, so on census historical data, 1991, 2001, 2011, everything is on spreadsheet on the census website. Right? So that's all Excel tables already worked out for you. 1961 to 1961, 1971, 1981, all the PDF files are available online for free. Right? So everything is, again, go to the Census Digital Library, all the PDFs are there. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know if maybe IIPS, International Institute of Population Sciences, has digitized it in terms of spreadsheet, but the PDFs are there. And then all you have to do, if you want to make a district level map, for example, the map I showed you on Marwari speakers is using a district level digitized file, using district level data. So going to each state of India, working out how many people speak Marwari at the district level. Right? So that's collation by the individual researcher. I'm not aware of anyone who's already done this for migration on a spreadsheet, but the PDF files are easily accessible online. Pre-independence, archive.org, and some of these other websites. So on my Google site, I have a tab called migration links. I have a separate tab called history links. And on the history links, I give a bunch of resources for historical data, which includes many of them, which will give you census website. So example, the chart I showed you in 1901. What I did was to go to each provincial census report. They would give you district level tables and then calculated the number of people and the total population. So that gives you the migration rate for the district. So there are 200 odd districts. I have 200 odd migration indicators based on the 1901 census. But that's again, getting a data entry operator or manually coding, the data out there. But having said that, a lot of economists, economic historians work with such data sets. And before doing manual data entry yourself, you should just reach out to these folks because a lot of these data sets are now digitized in terms of spreadsheets. So you just have to reach out to these folks and they'll give it.
Thanks for that. Rohit, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
I am Calcutta PhD student from IS department, and I see the role of digital technologies, like how the India is connected using digital technology in the last 10 years. Like what from the migration perspective, how it have changed is it like accelerating the process of migration?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. We tend to think that migration is something new or like it must be happening more. And so, like I showed you that chart, I mean, India has been a country of massive migration for quite some time. Massive migrations for certain pockets like coastal Orissa and so on. So you have unfortunately, without hard kind of evidence, I can't say that has mobile phones made India more mobile, right? Because people have been quite mobile even without mobile phones. People are quite mobile even before the national highways. And people are quite mobile in some parts of India, even before the Indian railways. Right? We do know that the Indian railways as a technology increased mobility in India. It seems obvious, and the facts are there. Transport leading to mobility is more kind of convincing to me than a pure communication effect. Right? So can just the adoption of mobile phones make India mobile because people can kind of navigate to places easier? I think it just makes life easier. But does it genuinely spur more migration or curtail more migration? I don't think so. So I would be I'd love to see some research on this. I think it's a great research question. But I also don't know how one might, answer this. Because I think mobile phones are used more as a way to keep in touch. And it makes, being away easier. But I don't think it really influences. Are people making choices of migration just because they have a mobile phone, which they did not have earlier? I don't think so. I think the need for migration is much more than whether you have a mobile phone or not. Right? It comes from economic opportunities or various other reasons.
Thank you.
So, Chinmay, Rashi has a question that I'm going to ask because I had it as well when you were talking about female migration and how marriage is usually given as the reason, and this could be sort of disguised economic migration in some ways. If this is the case, then what are some ways to think about how to tease out, the actual sort of reason for female migration?
Yeah, the way people have done it is to look at, for example, if you're using NSS where you have household or individual level files, is to basically code, so there's say you have an individual row in the National Sample Survey, and the woman says she has moved, so she's a migrant, and she has moved because of marriage, right? But she is also working. So you then do not code her as you do not code this particular woman as a, woman who has migrated for marriage. You would then code her as a person who's actually moved for work. So in that way, of course, the numbers bump up substantially. Suddenly you find a lot of women who are, in that. The only thing is you don't know exactly whether they're migrating. So this is a very, a big question. There is a lot of women who could potentially migrate, not work for some time, and then take up work, right? Versus individually where you say that, I'm going for work and then I get married, right? So there are a lot of subtleties in this particular thing. But the way researchers have looked at this is to look at women migrant workers. So the fact that they are migrant and that they are workers, combine them and you get, much, much higher rates then compared to, say, just women who have moved for marriage. So that's the way researchers have looked at it. I think Neeta, Indira Hirve, there are a lot of papers now on migration and gender which do that. And they do show that, there's substantial migration. Though, of course, the sex ratio data does make it clear that in many parts of India, migration is very sex selective and hugely male dominated.
Thanks. So Rishi Bhagwati has a question, which is, how often does migration directly inform or influence legislation in India? He says, I can think about the Assam Accord, which is yet to be taken seriously by any state government. But are there any interesting laws or policies, political party, I think, in Assam, but are there any interesting laws or policies that have come out straight out of migration trends? And, it also sort of leads to something I meant to ask you, which was around what, this is not directly related, but I've been wondering about the future of migration data, given, sentiments, sort of anti-outsider sentiments and the sort of, son of the soil legislation talk that's going on. And, whether that's something we need to keep in mind when we think about future migration data, even potentially the next census.
Yeah, so very quickly, in terms of migration data. So one is, of course, now the Election Commission has laid out some new rules. That is, it makes basically portability of voting easier. So that's like a new policy initiative, which is in a way linked with migration. The only real migration law of India is something called the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of 1978-79, which basically said that, contractors who have inter-border kind of labor transfers must be registered and so on. That law has rarely ever been kind of enforced, or people have, it's a law which exists, but nobody really uses, right? Having said that, there are now, of course, laws which restrict migration. Now, as per the Constitution of India, you can go from one place to another virtually anywhere in India, except a few zones. For example, Nicobar Islands, for example, a few parts of Northeast India. And so there are these scheduled areas, for instance, where you and I can't go without like a pass. Right? But otherwise, by the Constitution of India, it's guaranteed free mobility. Unfortunately, a lot of states now have passed laws at the state level saying job reservations for locals in the private sector. Right? Even the public sector, has a big history, but the private sector now, in Haryana, they did it. In Haryana, in fact, they have a law which says if you're in a sector which income less than 30,000 per month, 75% of jobs should be reserved for locals. Right? And this has been challenged in the courts by the business folks. Similar law in Andhra Pradesh. In fact, it's almost like a race to the bottom where virtually every political party across ideologies are promising this on a manifesto, saying if you vote us to power, we will reserve jobs for locals, right? And the height of it is that even Jharkhand has said this. Jharkhand is a state with net out migration, and they are saying that, we will have job reservations for locals, which is truly bizarre. So this is unfortunately a bug, and that's probably the hot potato issue when it comes to legislation and migration. A lot of the migration-related legislation is now to clamp down on internal migration. In international migration, we have another set on your passports. You would have seen this thing called ECNR for the longest time, immigration check not required, as an origin of more than 150 years linked with indentured migration. That is, kind of gone now, but that was a way in regulating international migration to stop trafficking and so on, right? But of course, that's no longer there. So I think that's broadly the interface of legislation and migration. But election commission, I think that's the most recent one, because now they're saying that, they're going to try and make life very easy for migrants to vote, because that's been a big blind spot of migration studies in India, migration and politics, that is, which is basically, can do migrants vote, or where do they vote? Do they go back and vote? Do they change the voting card that they have? For instance, as a migrant, I have voted in different parts of India. I voted in Mumbai, I voted in Hyderabad, I voted in Ahmedabad, and I've realized it's seamless. Within 2 days in most places, or within a few hours, you can change your election registration or where you can vote for. But most people don't do it, right? And that is why there's a huge part of people who are not voting. So that's another area where legislation and migration, you're seeing a lot of energy out there. And in terms of future of migration, which Rukmini is saying, definitely, precisely because of the anti-migrant sentiment, there is a sense that any migration data is seen with deep suspicion, and politicians will often make it up, make out migration to be some sort of a bad thing. And that's why recently, I've written a policy note with CPR arguing for an interstate migration council on the same lines as the goods and state tax. The GST council is for goods and services. Maybe we can have an interstate migration council, which is better to kind of talk about interstate migration. Because in the pandemic, the lack of migration data, the lack of any coordination on migration exposed us to the horrors of what that system can look like. When you had people walking stuck at state borders, the craziness of April, May 2020 during the first lockdown really showed us, that shows us what we really need to do. We need to have a much better understanding of especially internal migration.
Thanks. So just as our last question, I'm going to ask Tariq, who has a question.
Chinmay, thanks so much for that rich talk. Just a couple of quick questions, just for people, especially students who are thinking of using migration data in their work. One is on the metric that you really were talking about, the sex ratio, and you kind of showed a couple of different reasons why you think that could be a very useful measure, especially because of its wide availability. What would be your, do you have any kind of empirical concerns with using the sex ratio? You touched on this with certain kinds of migration, obviously for female economic migration, but are there broader things? There's so many things that affect the sex ratio that researchers should just be thinking of, especially if they're going to be using that measure, given its widespread availability. And the second was on the recent, you said the Google mobility data is potentially the most promising forward-looking data if it becomes available. The one point I didn't quite understand there was it that in your meeting with Google, they said that interstate mobility could be well proxied by this very local patterns of mobility. And I think that's what you said, but I didn't fully get that, why would my kind of movement to kind of restaurants and malls, etc., be a good predictor of my outward migration? That would be interesting, but just if you could say a sentence more about that.
Yeah, so the last part, what they were saying was that precisely because these migrants themselves would probably use some of these services. If migrants are going back, it would reflect in the Google mobility data itself at the district. For that district, suddenly you'll find fewer visitors, because the data is essentially how many visitors are there, indexed by how many users of, normalized by how many users are there overall. So over time, of course, in normal times, adoption of phones might be going up. So you just might get more visitors because, more phones are in town. So they normalize for that. But their argument was that if people go back, across states, it will still impact the district level indicator, right? So it's, while most of the people are within, so it's essentially intra-district mobility. Even if people are going out of the state as well, or substantially long distance migration, it will still put a pressure on this mobility score to go down. So that's what they were saying. And they actually had the interest rate numbers as well. That's really interesting, but they never released that. I did get to see, I mean, they made a presentation to me and I did get to see the numbers. And unfortunately, they don't provide that. So they could actually provide that, but they were saying that the correlation is very tight, and that's why they are not releasing interstate. And also, it was a global data set release, so they wanted to keep it uniform across regions and so on. The first one is the concern with sex ratio. I do have a paper on this. It's a book chapter in the India Migration Report of 2015. It's called The Missing Men, Sex Ratios and Migration. Yes, you can't use it blindly. I think the real indicator to look at is the percentage difference between the 20 to 40 age group sex ratio and the 0 to 20. Right? So if you just look at aggregate sex ratio, there's everything in it. There's the gender discrimination effects, sex differentials in mortality at childhood. We know that's huge in Haryana, Punjab, and so on. The whole missing girls phenomenon that Amartya Sen talked about. So historically in India, sex ratios have been used to understand the phenomenon of missing women, which is gender discrimination in mortality and so on in childhood levels. The fact is that at the 20 to 40 age group, the basic variation across districts in India is migration. And that's what this paper of mine looked at. It looked at mortality. I mean, there are two things that affect the sex ratios at later age cohorts. It's essentially mortality and migration. So you have to pay attention to both. And if there are not very large differences in sex difference and mortality, then any substantial blip from normal sex ratios is a migration. And that's why it's quite powerful. And the fact that you can generate it out of any survey, right, is the most attractive feature of that. But of course, you have to be careful. I mean, you want to use it wisely and not just you say sex ratio is high. That means this is a place where if you find a sex ratio of 1100 females to 1000 males, it does not necessarily mean that there's mass out migration. So you need to look at the age group, and that's why the indicator that I have and I've used, and that correlates at 0.7 and so on with migration indicators, is the percentage difference in the 20 to 40 age group sex ratio with the 0 to 20, right? And that's quite stark.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Chinmay. We've run over time, so we'll wind this up right now. Thanks very much to everyone at CASI, especially Alan Atchison, Sharad Pillai, and Amrita Kurian. Thanks also to Tariq, and thank you to the rest of the CASI team for helping out today. Our next talk will be on March 22nd. It's by the climate scientist, Dr. Roxy Kaul, who's a climate scientist at the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology in Pune. He'll be speaking about climate data, which is again something that I know many people in the social sciences as well are looking at incorporating in their research. Thanks very much. Please spread the word about this series, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thanks very much again for your time, Chinmay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and feel free to email me questions in case you've not raised the question. Happy to answer on email or social media.